Compulsion or obsessional neurosis, now known as obsessive-compulsive disorder, is increasingly plaguing more and more people. When describing obsession, Freud, as is very usual for him, hits the nail right on the head while also missing the point completely. He describes obsessive ideas as, quote, nothing but reproaches addressed by the subject to himself because of anticipated sexual pleasure, but these reproaches are disfigured by an unconscious psychic process of transformation and substitution, end of quote. While obsession is indeed a manifestation of a denied or repressed reproach, it doesn't necessarily stem from something sexual. It may or may not be the case. The obsession is an image that forces itself into one's consciousness against the individual's will. This mental representation cannot be escaped and pursues its victim until it leads to its enactment, which is then repeated over and over again in the form of a compulsion. It could be compared to phantom itching, a syndrome sometimes developed by those who have had shingles, a phenomenon comparable to phantom limbs. Even though you'll scratch your skin, the itching won't go away, because you're scratching the wrong spot. Your itching is not really on the surface, but it's in your mind. Engagement in an obsession possesses a certain religious, ceremonial quality. Obsessions remind me of acts that used to be common for the simple-minded, superstitious folk of old. When, for example, milk couldn't be left outside at night, lest the witches poison it and it turns blue. In this example, milk could be seen as the individual's sanity, and the witches as his shadow. The individual plagued by OCD is trying to prevent something evil from coming to the surface. In simple terms, the individual is trying to wash away some kind of internalized guilt. It can be either a repressed fear, or an immoral deed that one engages in willfully despite being aware of its immorality. Since this generates a conflict, the awareness of it is repressed. In those obsessed with hand-washing, for example, moral purity is replaced by physical cleanliness. The unconscious doesn't sleep forever though, and eventually it'll come to the surface and will keep pestering the subject until it's realized and dealt with properly. If the conscious refuses to acknowledge it, it'll take the form of an obsession. The compulsion solves it only temporarily. This can be a result of many problems. Sometimes the man-child, or puer-aeternus, due to his perpetual running from life and flying in the clouds, will develop a severe OCD due to living what Jung describes as provisional life. A puer-aeternus always seeks a new adventure and doesn't immerse himself fully in life. This jumping from one thing to another, however, means that he's always suspended in his waiting for someone or something better to come. This cycle of running, seeking and retreating is a compulsive behavior in itself. The obsession will pursue its victim until he settles down. Another origin of an obsession is denial of an action we know we shouldn't engage in. We find a justification for our guilty pleasure, but somewhere inside we know there's something off. Carl Jung had a patient once, a youth suffering from obsession neurosis, who was living off the money of who we'd now call a sugar mummy, but the woman didn't actually have that much money. The patient said that there's nothing wrong with it, since they both agreed on the conditions. Well, let's say that you manage to convince a child to give you its lunch every day. The child may agree out of naivety. It may be willing to help you out of the goodness of its heart, but every day it'll grow weaker and weaker while you feast. You both agreed on the conditions, but the immorality of it can't be clearer. The youth convinced himself completely that it's fine, but his repressed scruples found a way to haunt him. He became pathologically obsessed with the behavior. To illustrate this better, let's look at some TV characters' obsessions. For example, there is Nate Jacobs from Euphoria with his obsession with purity in women. On a closer look, this obsession is an escape from having to face his shadow. However, in his case, it can be said that he does really know how to deal with this due to his stunted development, and given that his outer persona is so fortified, it's very difficult to risk losing it lest the self crumbles. That's why the layers of the complex have to be peeled off slowly. He fears rejection from the one person he finds to be genuine in his fake world. When she's perceived as blemished by his father and visibly rejects Nate, it has catastrophic consequences for his self, as we could see in Season 1, where his aggressive persona took over. What Nate doesn't realise is that if he behaved differently, the world around him would transform. There are certain things Nate doesn't want to admit about himself, and that's why his personality is so obsessive. I've devoted a whole video to Nate Jacobs, so I suggest you have a look. Another good example is Monica Geller from Friends. She's known to be high maintenance, and her obsession with being organised is borderline pathological. In her case, my take is that she's still haunted by her shadow of insecurity from the times when she was fat. The high level of organisation and the need for perfection serve the function of a protective wall once the physical protective wall of fat has been erased. It's simply a trade-off, from obsession with food to obsession with order. If we look closely at individuals with anorexia, we often find something similar, except reversed. There is a noticeable obsession with thinness, and the compulsion is abstinence from eating. It's very often associated with an obsession with perfection, but in this case, it's what drives the disorder. Although anorexics avoid consuming food, they're obsessed with it and think about it constantly, both due to physiological and psychological starvation. Anorexia is often characteristic of an identification with the puer form of the animus, which is often associated with the mother complex and a conflict between reality and one's own fantasy. Something similar occurs in alcoholism and other forms of addiction as well. In the case of anorexia, the obsession is a result of the rejection of the sexually mature femininity. Since this is represented by the maternal image, it doesn't work in anorexia due to the mother complex, or rejection of the mother. Obsession thus serves the purpose of an escape from the devouring mother, or, depending on the situation, father. The reason why OCD has become more common today is clear. Drastic demoralization of the society, repression of order, and veneration of anarchy. Those who silence their psyche's voice that questions such behavior cannot, however, escape its echo, and so our common shadow is on the rise. But even though the shadow may be viewed negatively, it possesses a great transformative power. There isn't a single hero that's become a hero by running from his enemy. When we face the shadow, the ice inside breaks, and fresh water can finally flow through. The longer we run, the hungrier the beast grows. What's crucial is to realize and admit that there is an issue instead of avoiding it or ignoring it, and thus giving the shadow more power. Obsession is nothing more but a prolonged run from something that should have been faced long ago. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. If you like my content, please consider supporting me on Patreon.